Chapter 5, Fight or Flight. I don't think there's anything wrong with you, said the female voice from an unusual position behind me. I felt an index finger slide out of a place it definitely didn't belong and heard a latex snap. Done, the voice said. You can pull your jeans up now. I bent down and wrestled with my Levi's. As I fastened my belt buckle, I turned to face Jean Ruth, my local Greenwich Village doctor. She was a short, crumpled-looking woman in her 40s who always dressed for extreme comfort. Today she was wearing red tracksuit bottoms, hiking shoes, and a hand-knitted cardigan in Christmas tree colors. I wiped a film of dirt and sweat from my flesh brow. Outside, the amplified squawk of an NYPD squad car competed with a fire engine to drown out the throb of the heater, which was wedged underneath the only window in Dr. Ruth's tiny clinic. Bet she loved doing this first thing on a Monday morning, I said, in an effort to unwind the awkward tension. I couldn't, however, look Dr. Ruth in the eye. She had, after all, just pushed her finger at my anus. I don't know what to tell you, Christopher, sighed Dr. Ruth. Her use of my full name as it appeared on my health insurance card reminded me of visits to my childhood doctor in Wooler. It was strangely comforting. There's nothing unusual up there as far as I can tell. You know, stress can cause a lot of phantom symptoms. There is certainly nothing to suggest colonic cancer. It would be unusual for a 26-year-old with your health to have colonic cancer. Very unusual. I suddenly felt winded with guilt. Since arriving in New York, I had visited Dr. Ruth's clinic almost every other week. Each time I was convinced I would leave in an ambulance and doomed to spend the rest of my tragically short life in the death watch ward of St. Vincent's Hospital. My symptoms were varied, exotic, and, from Dr. Ruth's point of view, maddeningly nonspecific. My right leg keeps shaking. I need to urinate all the time. I feel dizzy. My back is sweaty. My skull bone aches. With the help of the internet, I would always self-diagnose in advance of my appointments. Once I had diabetes, another time Parkinson's. Then, of course, there was my near miss with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, caused by eating a hamburger made from mad cow. I later decided it was the premature onset of Alzheimer's. In 3 months, Dr. Ruth had literally got to know me inside out. On every visit, she would give me a weak smile before setting to work on me with her tools. Once her tests were complete, she would take notes in a pretty long hand, then declare me to be in unusually excellent health. At first, I didn't believe her. I had demanded blood tests, urine samples, MRIs, and CAT scans, the full hypochondriac's boot camp. I had consulted arm specialists, leg technicians, ear, nose, and throat experts. I received diagnostic bills from laboratories as far afield as Alaska. Before long, however, Dr. Ruth's verdicts started to act as their own medicine. I'd stride out of her clinic on 14th Street, feeling suddenly symptom-free. Sometimes I would smoke an ultralight cigarette in celebration, but within days I would start again. The symptoms would return, this time in a different combination. A long, sweaty session on the internet would confirm the very worst. Then it would be time to see Dr. Ruth again. By the time I got to her clinic, I would have already planned the music for my funeral. So I'm okay, I asked, looking at the heavy white plaster cast on Dr. Ruth's leg, which she had broken on a skiing trip to Vermont. Of the two of us, I internally conceded Dr. Ruth probably had the more serious medical problem. In fact, I wonder whether she resented the whole colon thing. Yes, she said wearily, you're okay, absolutely fine. What about you? That leg looks painful. Fine, it's an inconvenience, that's all. She threw the used latex glove into the bin with only slightly more force than necessary, then hobbled across the room, using the windowsill for balance. Her metal crutch, I noticed, was propped up by the door. Dr. Ruth really didn't look very well at all. She coughed into her hand, picked up a tissue, and emptied her nasal passage. I noticed that her nose was raw with blowing. Stress can do a lot of things to your body, Christopher, she croaked. And I think your body is susceptible to it right now. Moving from London to New York is a big change. I know you're used to dealing with stress with your job, but you can't underestimate the effects of culture shock. You probably have an intestine that reacts badly to anxiety, which is causing you to experience the symptoms you describe. Try not to panic so much. It's just anxiety. One intestine? Surely one broken entrail couldn't cause me so much discomfort. Then another thought struck me. But how can I be stressed? There's nothing to be stressed about. I have a nice apartment, I have a girlfriend, my job's going well. It's not like I'm being sent to war for gosh sakes. I'm a spoiled yuppie. I don't even feel all that stressed. It's just I feel so bloody wretched all the time. Dr. Ruth sat down heavily. Christopher, listen to me. Anxiety doesn't work like that. It can just build up in your system without you realizing it. That's what's happening to you right now. Your mind is channeling all your stress into phantom symptoms. Think about it. You need to pee all the time. Anyone can convince themselves they need to pee all the time, just like anyone can convince themselves they want to throw up. I can give you something for it if you want. It depends on how bad you think it is. I have no problem prescribing you some Zoloft. The thought of taking antidepressants depressed me. No, absolutely not, I muttered. I'll be fine. I'll deal with it. Zoloft isn't only for No, really? No, I said. Dr. Ruth gave me a long look, then shrugged. Okay. She announced before hauling herself out of her chair and limping toward the door. Here, take this with you, she said, picking up a leaflet entitled Facts About Irritable Bowel Syndrome. You should also try this. She handed me a square paper bag of brown gunk labeled fiber supplement. Just add water and drink it in the morning, she said. It's unpleasant, but it might help. She gave me another low-wattage smile as she leaned on the doorknob. Good luck, Christopher. And come back if you need anything. Not that I need to tell you that, of course. I walked out with a worried grunt and signed insurance documents at the reception desk, then jammed myself into the creaking elevator with some of my fellow patients, all of them toothless and geriatric. They look so damn healthy to me. So, how did I end up in New York? The nib I completed for Barrow on that traumatic Friday was followed by more nibs. Then, in a profound development of my Times career, some lead nibs. Eventually, I was trusted with a few proper news stories which carried my name at the top of them. My copy of How to Read the Financial Pages, meanwhile, became ripped and bent with heavy consultation. By August, Barrow had agreed to pay me £30 for a 9-hour shift. I soon became fluent in finance, able to riff confidently on price-earnings ratios, dividend yields, Pac-Man defense strategies, stock option trigger prices, and discounted cash flow and balance sheet analysis, as though I knew what it all meant. I watched and rewatched Oliver Stone's Wall Street with Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko in the hope of eventually understanding the plot. Then the lunches started. My first was with the chief executive of Treat, a fragrance manufacturer. The lunch wasn't held in a restaurant, but in the catered offices of a PR firm. I followed Robert Cole's advice to the word. As homework, I read the novel Perfume by Patrick Susskind, so that I would have something to talk about over the appetizer. After, of course, I discussed the weather, the traffic, and the route my cab had taken. It worked flawlessly, as Cole had said it would. By the time the fish course arrived, "Hope you like skate," whispered the PR woman. My nerves and nausea had gone. I had, however, drained half a bottle of Cabernet by then. As the weeks passed, I became a veteran of the business lunch. Cole's tutorial had liberated me from the nervous dyspepsia that had ruined countless social occasions since I'd left home at the age of 18. Now I had some catching up to do. I consumed fields of lamb shanks, oceans of lobster tails, and pints of gazpacho. I snacked on blinis and shards of Parmigiano Reggiano. I scarfed steak tartare with fried garlic-soaked bread for breakfast. In short, I became fat. My head, with its permanent sunburn and sheen of boo sweat, inflated. My waistline bullied my trouser seam. By the time a new business editor was appointed, I had become a restaurant snob, never to be tempted again by the color photographs in a Pizza Hut menu. Cook's replacement was a redoubtable woman named Patient Wheatcroft, a middle-aged mother with a teenager's figure who had previously worked at the tabloid Mail on Sunday. Her wardrobe was sensational. She would click into the office on Manolo Blahnik stilettos, wearing a short leather skirt and checkered red and black Chanel jacket, accessorized with oversized gold buttons. Her stilettos, the office soon learned, came in a variety of violent shades: blood red, furious purple, and death black. Once she turned up in the office in a cowboy jacket with tassels. She reminded me of one of Donald Trump's ex-wives, the flamboyant 80s anachronism and the sleek monochrome 90s. From the day she was appointed, she introduced herself to her subordinates by asking them in turn, "What exactly do you do here?" Patience was known only by her first name. She was too terrifying to be dismissed as Wheatcroft. She did, however, earn an unofficial nickname, Margot, which was whispered only after particularly heroic lunchtime boozing sessions. It came from the 1970s BBC sitcom The Good Life, in which Margot Ledbetter, played by Penelope Keith, is the prim Little England conservative who lives next door to two hippie-ish, downwardly mobile neighbors who are earnestly trying to opt out of the rat race by raising their own livestock and growing vegetables. Some on the business desk also liked to joke that when Patience went home at night, she swapped her aristocratic warble for an unfashionable Birmingham drawl, switching back into character at 10 o'clock the next morning. I liked Patience a lot, even though she made my palms sweat. She in turn saw me as cheap and motivated labor, parentheses, that is, poor and indebted, close parentheses. So she gave me a temporary 6-month contract worth £9,000. I was immensely grateful. Unable to get excited by banking, insurance, or heavy industry, I suggested stories on media and technology companies. Barrow, who had made his name in business journalism by covering the oil industry during Gulf War I, was not very impressed. "But Chris, they don't make anything," he said with a pinched face. Regardless, the media beat was a good way to get invited to parties in Soho with B-list celebrities and it girls. In the technology industry, meanwhile, something very curious was happening. I began writing features on the wildly out of proportion stock market success of firms such as Yahoo, whose young founders had made millions each after going public. It seemed as though the Americans were getting excited over nothing. At the time, I used the business section's computer to go online. It had a dial-up modem the size of concrete block, which downloaded web pages at a rate of 1 frame per day, making it a useless research tool. How could this be the future? As the dot-com boom started to echo across the Atlantic, however, I became converted and my contract was upgraded to a staff position. Patience eventually gave me a technology column, and as the speculative bubble inflated, some of my stories started to appear on the front page. On a few occasions, PR firms flew me first class to Silicon Valley to interview the billionaire chiefs of Oracle, Intel, and Cisco Systems. I even met Bill Gates. Parentheses, so did Patience. Quote, "Not even $45 billion can guarantee freedom from dandruff," she clucked on her return. Close parentheses. By 1999, my responsibilities had been expanded to cover media and telecommunications, and by 2000, I was also editing a weekly section on e-business. My career, like that of so many other young and hopelessly inexperienced dot-commers, had been built entirely on the funny money of the hyperinflated internet economy. I was, in short, a fraud. But when the position of Wall Street correspondent became free in late 2000, I was in the ideal position to seize it. "You're probably too young for this job," Patience told me, "but it's yours. Just don't muck it up. I'll be watching you." I had lobbied Patience for the New York job without really thinking about what would happen if I got it, and so the enormity of my move to Manhattan only really sank in as I stood outside my new office at 1211 6th Avenue, or to use its official name, Avenue of the Americas. The building is one of several imposing skyscrapers that make up the Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan. The 70s-style behemoth, which looks like a scaled-down version of the former World Trade Center, is also the headquarters of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation in America. The Fox News studio is on the ground floor, the New York Post's headquarters on the 9th and 10th, and Murdoch's executive suite somewhere in between the two. On any given day, even during the most violently cold weeks of December, there is a crowd of woolly-hatted tourists and hot dog sellers outside 1211, partly because of the celebrities being escorted in and out of the Fox studio, and partly because of the news ticker, an LED display that wraps around the front of the building and displays scrolling news headlines 24 hours a day. I felt like a celebrity myself as I pushed my way past the gawping and munching throng and through the revolving doors to the security desk. As the elevator pulled me up to the 9th floor with the metallic whine, I concluded that it made sense for the Times, one of News Corp's most prestigious properties, to open its New York bureau at 1211. I pictured myself, white napkin tucked into my shirt collar, at weekly power lunches with Rupert and his inner power circle. Just in case the boss was in the office, I'd worn my least stained tie and business suit. Although I had never been inside 1211 before, I had formed an impression of it from the weekly column of Joanna Coles, the Times' sassy and witty New York correspondent. It appeared under terrifying headlines such as "Englishmen vs. American Men, Good Fun, but better sex. And it's official, men are the new single women. Joanna's weekly missive was accompanied by a picture of what looked like the star of several Hollywood romantic comedies. She had a knowing, skeptical pout, she was from Yorkshire, and an immaculate blonde hairdo that undoubtedly cost several $100s a month to maintain. I secretly fantasized that Joanna might be single and interested in a younger, slightly overweight reporter with receding hair. She was, in fact, engaged to a world-renowned author. Joanna was infamous in Wapping for having negotiated a contract with the editor, Peter Stothard, that prohibited her from the menial task of writing news stories. The deal, envied by almost every journalist on Fleet Street, meant she could concentrate exclusively on her column and splashy features for the tabloid section. It was like a flight attendant refusing to serve drinks to anyone other than first-class passengers. I could only imagine how bored she would be by the prospect of working with someone who wrote about Wall Street mergers and acquisitions. In the elevator, I imagined the glamour that awaited me. The huge Times logo above the reception area, the pristine glass walls, the splatterings of modern art, the chic office assistants, and the Conran furniture. With a mechanical clank, the elevator's chrome curtains opened. There were 2 smudged glass doors to either side of me, one leading to an open plan work area, and the other to a reception desk with the New York Post sign above it. The Post logo slanted sideways as if it's in a New York Post sign. The Post logo slanted sideways as if it's in a hurry, made me feel like Clark Kent reporting for work at the Daily Planet. Behind the reception desk sat a stern African-American woman wearing white surgical gloves. I approached, scanning the walls for the distinctive royal insignia of the Times. There was none. "Hi," I said rather breathlessly. "I'm the new man at the Times." "The what?" The woman didn't look up. She appeared to be using a machete to open mail. There was ink on her white gloves. "The Times," I repeated, then unnecessarily. "The London Times, the Times of London, the Times, newspaper." The knife continued its work. The woman's frown deepened. I noticed a television set hanging from the ceiling, blaring out the military-sounding theme for the Fox News channel. I felt suddenly self-conscious and dizzy, like a schoolboy sent to the principal's office. Did she not understand my English accent? Was it that strong? My gosh, I thought, maybe no one in New York or the United States would understand me. Perhaps I'm doomed to failure. "Fair and balanced," declared the television. "The Times' bureau is on this floor, isn't it?" I asked as politely as I could. Still no reaction. A muscular Fox News anchor began talking over the clatter of drums. Had I offended her somehow? I don't know, sir." She dropped the knife, threw open a drawer, and thumped a telephone directory down on her desk, all in one flawless, angry motion. "Times?" she said accusingly. Yes." "Not listed." "That can't be right." "Who is it, sir, you wish to see?" Finally, a chink of light in the dark. "Adam Jones," I blurted. Adam was the Times reporter whose job I was taking. "Oh, you mean Adam." The trenches in her forehead disappeared, and her barbed snare became a gleaming wall of enamel. I felt an inappropriate amount of relief. "Let me call him for you. Please take a seat." One white glove picked up the telephone handset, and the other keyed in an extension number. The woman gestured toward a cheap-looking black leather sofa. Next to it was a plastic potted plant. I was too nervous to sit. Perhaps I thought I had made a terrible mistake. Eventually, Adam appeared from behind the reception desk. He was a bookish man with angular spectacles and an overnight growth of stubble. "Welcome," he said, shaking me firmly by the hand. I thought I could detect a hint of irony. Adam produced an electronic swipe card and used it to take me through the second glass door and into the office area. "This is it," he said flatly. The office looked like the set from an old episode of NYPD Blue. Its negative aura would have been enough to put a feng shui consultant in the hospital. Underfoot was a sticky, matted carpet on which had been placed brown metal and plastic office furniture. The air held a strong whiff of burned percolator coffee and pretzels as a handful of plants wilted under fluorescent strip lights. I saw no sign of a Times logo anywhere, or indeed any staff apart from a couple of young, bored-looking African-American messengers and an ancient mailroom worker who was coughing violently while sorting grumpily through envelopes. His coughs were punctuated by the occasional, "Damn it," followed by self-pitying groans. Bundles of mail, everything from handwritten letters to bulky brown UPS packages, most of them addressed to the editor, were stacked everywhere. Adam winced. I had known Adam in London. During my hellish first week as an intern there, he had reminded me of an intimidating third-year student at the university who occasionally handed out insider advice to freshmen. Because he seemed slightly distant and phlegmatic most of the time, I was immensely grateful whenever he warmed up and gave me one of his fireside chats. After a 2-year stint in Manhattan, Adam seemed ready to leave, and I got the impression he was puzzled that I would want his job. I was surprised, however, that he'd agreed to go back to London to take my old position on the business desk. In fact, Adam had been secretly offered a job at the Financial Times and had no intention of returning to the Wapping printing plant. Adam escorted me to my office, which turned out to be a cubicle cordoned off from the empty cubicles next to it by a brownish plastic and cork wall that also doubled as a bulletin board. This is what Douglas Coupland had meant when he talked about veal fattening pens in Generation X, I thought. Behind the cubicle was a long tabletop covered in yellowing copies of English and Australian newspapers. "The Lou's that way," said Adam, pointing toward an LED display hanging from the ceiling. It read, 31 calls waiting. I appeared over the plastic and cork cordon and came face to face with a woman sporting a New Jersey permit and leather miniskirt. She was painting her nails. She looked up and smiled. This surely couldn't be Joanna. I felt as though I had stumbled into an episode of The Twilight Zone. "No, Julie," came the nasal reply, followed by a squawk of laughter. "Oh, right," I said, offering a pale, trembling hand. "Chris, the Times man?" She gave me a blank look. "Ad sales," explained Adam. The New York Bureau of the Times, it seemed, was a single cubicle wedged between the mailroom and the advertising sales department of the New York Post. In fact, the Times' bureau was actually in the mailroom, and no one seemed to know it existed. Adam hadn't yet cleared his desk, which was meticulously tidy in maximum contrast to the surrounding chaos. So he showed me to the spare cubicle next to it. I lifted a pile of undelivered mail from the broken swivel chair and sat down. "This is your computer," said Adam, pointing to a device that looked as though it predated the vacuum cleaner. I had to kneel down on the sticky carpet, avoiding someone's dusty, half-eaten croissant, to locate the on button. "Don't look at the keys," came Adam's voice from above. He made an ew face. I looked. The keys had turned almost black with newspaper ink from hundreds of deskless IT support staff, freelancers, and secretarial temps. The gaps between the keys, meanwhile, served as gutters for spilled drinks and crumbs. The desk was slick with rings of congealed coffee and grease from countless only takeout lunches. I would later learn that my deadline was 3 p.m., which made lunch breaks almost impossible unless they were taken at 4 p.m., as the waiters cleared the tables around you. I noticed that in Adam's cubicle there was a heavy 38-inch Sony television set, a late 1980s model tuned permanently to CNBC, the American Business News Channel. I wondered how Adam had time to watch television during the day. "You'll find the Aussies sometimes use this desk," said Adam, picking up an empty can of Foster's from behind my computer monitor and dropping it in the bin. "They share the New York Bureau with us." The Aussies, I later learned, were 2 New York reporters for News Corp's Australian papers. The brutal 13-hour time difference between Manhattan and Sydney meant that the Aussies kept very odd hours. Sometimes, clearly, cans of Australian lager were required to keep them motivated. Before my spirits had time to sink any further, Adam offered to introduce me to Joanna. I stood up and turned around, catching a glimpse of blonde through a glass office door. Thank goodness, I thought, the bureau is larger than one cubicle. I wondered if Adam had also fantasized about having an office romance with Joanna. Then I remembered that he was married. Adam swung open the door to her office, which had little more charm than my cork enclosure. "Joanna, this is Chris," he said, then jogged back to his desk where his phone was ringing. "Hi," said Joanna with impressively feigned interest. I had noticed that she was also watching television, CNN, and had a copy of the New York Times open in front of her. She was wearing stretchy trousers, a heavy sweater, and no makeup, but she still looked glamorous. "So, you're the new Wall Street guy," she said in an enthusiastic but motherly tone that reminded me of my old high school English teacher and immediately destroyed any serious notion of a Mrs. Robinson affair. "So I expect you'll soon be getting used to Lipton View," she said. "I'm sorry. Why was she talking about the lift? And there was no view. We were a long way from the window, and besides, we were on a low floor. Once again, I felt like a schoolboy. Lift and view, Chris, is what we do here. Her sentences, I noticed, were emerging fully formed from her mouth as though part of a pre-written column. Had she researched the speech, or was she as intimidatingly bright as I feared she might be? We lift from the New York Times. She held up the copy on her desk. And we watched the news. She pointed to CNN. We lift and view. If you can get the hang of that, you too can be a foreign correspondent. Her blue eyes bored into me. Was this a test? Was she serious? I laughed and said something about exclusives and off-diary. Good luck, she said. The next few months proved Joanna's point. Foreign reporting from New York, it seemed, involved an awful lot of following up stories from the New York Times and watching CNBC. I had imagined something more glamorous. Given the number of stories I had to write and the wide range of subjects to cover, it was almost impossible to make insider contacts, the PRs, bankers, and analysts who usually supply journalists with scoops. Joanna, of course, had been deliberately provoking me with her lift and view comments. Parentheses, she had, after all, managed to get the first interview with O.J. Simpson following his acquittal. But I wondered how Adam had found the time to leave the office and profile everyone from Donald Trump to Jeff Bezos, the nerdish founder of Amazon.com. Patience and Barrow, however, seemed impressed with the hasty robotic rewrites I produced for them every morning. Meanwhile, I tried to distract myself from work by creating a social life. My initial attempts at meeting women, however, didn't go well. My first date with an Upper West Sider named Sadie Smith, who spent the evening quizzing me about Prince William and telling me about her plan to produce a stage adaptation of a porn film, it later became an off-Broadway hit. Meanwhile, the dizziness I had felt on my first day in the office kept returning. That was when my sessions with Dr. Ruth began. By spring, I had found a girlfriend. Her name was Alana, a tall, graceful Midwesterner with a concave stomach and hair cut into a Cabernet bob. She voted Democrat and wore pointy-collared shirts with pinstripe pantsuits. For a girl who'd grown up in rural Ohio, she adapted well to city life. For a start, her apartment was so small it barely had 4 walls, and then there was her New Yorker attitude. On one of our early dates at a West Village pavement cafe, she had warded off an abusively drunk hobo by picking up a heavy ashtray and threatening him with it. The hobo fled. I found Alana's confidence reassuring. She was, in fact, the alpha male in our relationship. Not that I would have ever admitted that. But I still wasn't happy. I couldn't work out what was wrong with me. Why, for example, was I so frazzled by nerves? After all, my generation, the fat-spoiled offspring of the 70s, have nothing, or at least very little, to be nervous about. Take disease. We're so doped up at birth with flu jabs and pox shots that the only life-threatening illness we're likely to get is the self-inflicted one. As for hunting and gathering, the nearest we get is the remote control and the takeout menu. Then there's our day-to-day safety. Last century, a car crash at anything over 30 miles per hour would be a guarantee of death, or at least of a coma and an off switch. Today, you can lose control of a cheap Korean saloon traveling at 110 miles an hour down a hill in a monsoon and suffer only minor airbag bruising. We're virtually indestructible. Then, of course, there's war. The children of Reagan and Thatcher, my generational brothers and sisters, on both sides of the Atlantic are war virgins, never drafted into military service, never invaded by a foreign army, never expected to defend their countries with their lives. The few conflicts we've lived through, the Falklands, Gulf War I, Bosnia, lasted a few days or weeks and were fought by volunteers, not schoolyard conscripts. The Allied forces, it seems, could win any war with a few stealth bombers and an A-10 Warthog. Air offensives could be conducted online, like banking. One click of a mouse in the Pentagon and a Kosovar village disappears. Casualties, on our side at least, were extraordinarily low. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British lost 19,240. During the entire Gulf War, the British death count was 47. As teenagers watching television at home, it was tempting to regard these latter-day conflicts as entertainment, really video games. Perhaps it was because we had grown up being told that a proper war would involve 50 megaton nukes. The Soviet arsenal alone, we learned in the 80s, could kill 22 billion, and yet there were only 4 billion people in the world to kill. Back in the winter of 1991, it was almost a relief for us to discover that war was still possible without Armageddon. So why, as a generation, are we so drenched in adrenaline? What could explain the $3.4 billion that Pfizer made in 2004 by selling its anti-anxiety drug Zoloft? For the war virgins, the adrenal cortex should be an obsolete piece of biotechnology. Our lives are safe, pampered, and free from almost every kind of stress that troubled our ancestors. Perhaps, I often wonder during my treks to Dr. Ruth's clinic, the human body will produce adrenaline regardless of the circumstances. And perhaps without mortal danger, our adrenal glands get bored and start firing at random. It's not so much a disorder as a malfunction. A trip to the mall becomes as fraught as they tiptoe through a minefield. A new job as terrifying as trench warfare. There is, however, a more troubling explanation, that the adrenaline is coming from our subconscious. The war virgins, after all, know that our lifestyles can't last, that our comfort and safety is unsustainable. At school, our teachers were the first to break the news about the dwindling oil reserves, the leaking ozone layer, the third world. Even rock stars, those icons of the short term, started lecturing us about starving Ethiopians and disappearing rainforests. Our parents, it seemed, had not thought things through. In fact, they'd really fucked up. Cheers, Mom. Thanks, Dad. And so, as much as we enjoy our modern invincibility, we wait for it to end. We wait for the inevitable. Even war, we know, will eventually come, probably from those at the wrong end of the first world's consumption binge. Technology will one day turn against us. The Moore's Law that gave us cheap PCs, video games, and iPods will also make possible the homemade atomic bomb detonated in Trafalgar Square. The 90s, of course, were an attempt at denial. With our gratified chunks of Berlin Wall on the mantelpiece, we stopped worrying about global politics. The Cold War was over, and as one of the most influential books of the decade said, it was the end of history. Our Greenpeace subscriptions lapsed. We bought luxury German SUVs. As for our unsustainable lifestyles, we convinced ourselves that the new economy would solve everything. Oil? It was so old economy. We took jobs in advertising and marketing and tortured ourselves with images of the nearly but not quite obtainable. We blamed our anxiety on money or sex. We stopped thinking. We bought shares in .com companies, and we skimmed through the stories about missing suitcase-sized nukes and titillated ourselves instead with Bill Clinton, the intern, and the cigar. We were distracted, borderline delusional, but it wouldn't last. It's fight or flight, Dr. Ruth told me during one of my hypochondriac workouts. It's also called the acute stress response. You're a journalist, you should look it up. Walter Cannon, born in Wisconsin in 1871, went to Harvard Medical School. He said animals react to threats with a general discharge of the sympathetic nervous system. In other words, with the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the medulla of the adrenal glands. So your muscles tighten, the heart rate increases, and blood vessels constrict. Young men used to need that on the battlefield, Christopher. And as much as your problems might seem, well, completely trivial, they are still causing the same animal fight or flight response. We call it an anxiety disorder, which is why you come here so often, and why I tell you to take Zoloft. The word trivial, I remember noting at the time, was emphasized rather too heavily. My malfunctioning body, concluded Dr. Ruth, was permanently stuck in flight mode. It was telling me to empty my bowels, turn on my heels, and run as fast as possible, away from the West Village. I was a clinical coward. While we're on the subject of war and virginity, I should probably tell you about my other granddad on my mother's side. Ross Selkirk Taylor was a smart and particular young man with black-rimmed spectacles and rather too much Brill cream in his hair. His idea of a good time was a pack of full-length players, a date with my future grandmother Florence, or Flo as he sometimes called her, and Tommy Dorsey on the record player. Unlike my father's father, Granddad Taylor had no problem gripping a rifle. And so at the age of 21, he was drafted into the Royal Army Service Corps and handed a rifle, 6 rounds of ammunition, and the keys to a 3-ton Bedford truck. Their first order given to 121357 driver Ross Taylor was to drive to Boulogne in northern France, where he would help the British Army fight off a German invasion, if one ever came. The date was February 1940. My grandfather had never been abroad before. That might explain the entry he made Saturday, March 2nd in the Brown Leather Automobile Association diary that my grandmother had given him as a Christmas gift. Not very impressed by France at present, although it may get better. He wrote this in pencil, being careful not to make a mistake or use up more than the square inch of space allocated to each day. France, of course, did not get better. It got a lot worse. In the diary, Driver Taylor went on to disclose that he had tasted his first glass of champagne in France and was confined to barracks for smoking players in the Bedford's cab. In fact, Driver Taylor's incarceration in the barracks was ended only by compassionate leave when he was ordered home to Newcastle upon Tyne to visit his dying mother. Doesn't seem much hope for mother, he wrote on the weekend of March 23rd. Said nothing to nobody, though. 2 days later, my great-grandmother, Margaret Taylor, died from a kidney infection. After returning to France, my grieving grandfather was cheered up by good weather and a football match with the French, which, against all the odds, the British won. He even spent a day at the Burke Plage seaside resort, later to become the subject of one of Sylvia Plath's bleakest poems. Looking back, the day at the beach was a terrible omen. That night, there was a terrifying air raid. Then, on May 15th, Driver Taylor was ordered to drive southeast to pick up the 7th Battalion Royal West Kents, an infantry unit. That was when Hitler invaded. My grandfather and the West Kents were ordered to meet an advancing Nazi Panzer Division head-on. These were Driver Taylor's diary entries after leaving the Boulogne barracks. Saturday, set off at 1:30 a.m. to proper hellhole. Found we were in front line, machine-gunned. Discovered we were surrounded all night. Enemy know nothing of us. Luckiest people on earth to get out. Sunday. What a morning. Expecting enemy to move in on us any time. Any minute. Retreat, 3:30 a.m., 20 miles back. Monday. Moved up to Albert. Got blasted to hell. Captured in afternoon. Rode on horseback to village. Each diary entry, of course, tells only one square inch of the story. The West Kents had met the German army near the town of Albert, come under heavy fire, then retreated. It was then that my grandfather realized he'd never been shown how to fire his rifle and that its barrel was still full of grease. After being told by a commander that the Germans were moving backward, the West Kents motored forward again, only to run into an ambush in Albert's village square. The square was famous for its church, which had been flattened by the Germans during World War I, leaving only a wobbly statue of the Madonna standing. The West Kents were standing near that statue smoking cigarettes when a German Messerschmitt fell out of the sky and started spitting out lead. My grandfather managed to stomp on the Bedford's accelerator pedal before being hit. He swerved down a boulevard only to meet a German blockade with a machine gun in the middle of it. He threw himself out of the truck before the gun opened fire. Then he ran, eventually meeting up with 3 other surviving West Kents. The shell-shocked soldiers tried to hide in a line of French refugees, but with their British Army uniforms and bloody faces, the French shooed them away. Later, the Luftwaffe opened fire on the unarmed civilians anyway. The West Kents had nowhere to go, and soon enough my grandfather and his friends were captured. That evening, the Germans decided to transport Driver Taylor on a horse without a saddle to the nearest town. Fearing he would fall off, my granddad tied a piece of string around one of the animal's ears, hauled himself onto its bare back, and set off nervously. At that very moment, however, a German machine gun went off and the horse bolted, catapulting my granddad into a razor wire fence. Bloody, terrified, and exhausted, he finally made it on foot to the camp. The next morning, he was ordered on a 3-week march to Germany, covering 30 kilometers a day and sleeping in cattle fields. What little food he ate was given to him by locals who pitied the starving prisoners. In the town of Trier, he was shoved into a railway truck and eventually taken to Poznan, a port on the Warta River in Poland. There, as British prisoner of war number 4552, he joined a working party that tore down the Poznan Zoo so that it could be turned into a military airfield. He also operated a crane in a quarry. At one point, the POWs tried to kill a Nazi guard by dropping a boulder on him. He spent the rest of the war as a laborer near Freiwaldau, now called Jasnik, on the Czech-Polish border. Within 2 weeks of returning to Newcastle, Driver Ross Taylor married Florence and was put on paid leave by the British Army. Then he came down with tuberculosis caused by 5 years of malnutrition. Doctors treated him by collapsing one of lungs and putting him in a sanatorium for 9 months. He survived all of this, needless to say, without the need for Zoloft, trauma counseling, or French existential literature. After recovering from TB, he put himself through night school and set about making himself a member of the English middle class. Sometimes on my way to Dr. Ruth's clinic, I would think about my grandfather, and I would feel guilt, the heavy, suffocating kind. It wasn't just my health that was bothering me in New York. I was also thoroughly sick of Lifton View. I met up with other English foreign correspondents to see if they shared my frustration with rehashing other people's stories. Toby Moore of the Daily Express told me despondently that foreign reporters were a dying breed. The paper's new proprietor, one-time porn magnate Richard Desmond, had decided to get rid of all overseas bureaus apart from New York. This made Toby the last staff foreign correspondent ever employed by the newspaper, founded in 1900 and bought 16 years later by Lord Beaverbrook. Ironically, the Express had once been famous for its global reach, and in 1936 had the largest circulation of any publication on Earth. In place of foreign correspondents, Desmond used young, poorly paid reporters in London to follow up stories from the online editions of overseas newspapers. Clearly, it wasn't just Joanna who knew about Lifton View. Within weeks, Toby was back in the UK. Desmond had shut down the New York bureau to save more money. I feared my job could also disappear. The dot-com boom, after all, had turned into a financial catastrophe, and the economy was lurching into a recession. The new economy, it seemed, wasn't that new after all. Just a plain old speculative financial bubble. Patients started to reject my expense claims, and in one curt phone call, ordered me to cut the overhead of the New York bureau. Manhattan, however, was in denial. The hedonism of the 90s, as epitomized by Sex and the City, was still the norm. There was also, however, a palpable sense of foreboding. Repossession trucks towed Porsches from outside fashionable loft apartments, such as the one I lived in at 666 Greenwich Street. The West Village's trendy candlelit restaurants started to feel emptier on weeknights. The homeless multiplied, and the cheesy Europop of the 90s had been replaced by the depressive bleeping of Radiohead's Kid A. Then, of course, there was George W. Bush, a president no one in New York seemed to like. The war virgins, I concluded, had been spoiled for too long. Part of me wondered whether it would be stress or Patience's budget cuts that ended my stint as a Wall Street correspondent. I decided that a holiday in England, my first return to Britain after moving to New York, might help clear my mind. So I booked myself a ticket through News Corp's travel department and turned up at John F. Kennedy Airport, only to discover the company had automatically put me in first class at a cost to Patience of $5,126.32. That was it, I thought. I was done. The travel agent had assumed I was a News Corp executive traveling with Rupert Murdoch's entourage. I couldn't face telling Patience about it in person, so I emailed her instead. "Oh dear," was her 2-word reply, followed by a week of silence. I spent the rest of my holiday convinced that she would fire me, and in the end, however, shut me off, even though I had offered to pay the difference in fares, which amounted to $4,739. For the first time since Patience had arrived at the times I wanted to hug her. By the time I got back on my United Airlines jet at Heathrow, I was exhausted, still unwell, and not sure I was happy about going back to New York. But weren't people supposed to love New York, the city that never sleeps? Tried hard to feel love, but none came. At least I thought I could savor a guilt-free first-class flight. I needed all the sleep I could get. The date was September 10th, 2000.